Today, I want to tell you about a conqueror who became the ancestor of millions, with 1 in every 200 people carrying his DNA today.
But before our story begins, wherever you are, whatever your day has held, let it all gently unravel now. Settle into your pillow, feel the warmth of your blankets, and let your breathing find a slow, steady rhythm. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, but to listen and to drift. And a gentle reminder to subscribe to our channel, to like this video, and to click the bell so more people can find their way to these quiet stories. Consider this: 1 in every 200 men alive now, from the bustling cities of Europe to the vast plains of Asia, carries a silent, living inheritance from a single man. He was not a figure of myth, nor a hero from an epic poem, but a real, breathing person who walked this earth 8 centuries ago. When we hear his name, our minds conjure images of thundering hooves and vast empires rising from the dust. For some, he is the ultimate strategist. For others, a force of unimaginable destruction. But tonight, let us set those visions of battle and conquest aside. For there is another chapter to his life, one spoken of less often, yet whose impact on our world is just as profound. Think of it: 16 million men, each carries a piece of his genetic code. This is not a romantic fable, but the cold, hard data of genetics. Researchers discovered a unique marker in the Y chromosome, a pattern that repeated with astonishing frequency. They traced its roots back to one source, a man who lived in Mongolia during the 13th century. His name was Genghis Khan. 16 million descendants. That number is greater than the population of many modern nations. It is a genetic legacy unmatched by any king, any emperor, any other person in the history of our world. We know about his empire of land and conquest. It fractured, it crumbled, it eventually faded from the map. But another empire remained, an empire of blood, written not on parchment, but in the very building blocks of life. And this empire endures to this very day, and this is not an exaggeration. We are accustomed to history being a chronicle of battles, but for Genghis Khan, the most pivotal campaigns were not always fought on the open field. They continued in the felt-lined confines of yurts, in carefully arranged marriage alliances, in the complex fates of the women who stood beside him, whether by choice or by the right of conquest. His harem was not merely a place of pleasure, as romantic novels might suggest. It was a second front, an instrument of power. Every marriage sealed a new political bond. Every concubine represented a subdued rival. Every daughter was a living promise, a strand in a growing web of diplomacy. And if the battlefield won him territories, it was his women who secured his influence over the future itself. Tonight, let us walk this path together. From his mother, Hoylun, a woman of immense strength who single-handedly saved her 5 children from starvation in the merciless steppe, to his chief wife, Borte, who became a Khatun, a ruler in her own right, commanding her own army of servants and guards. From the concubines, passed as symbols of power, to the thousands of children, his living legacy scattered like seeds across the continents of Eurasia. What did it mean to be the wife of Genghis Khan, or his mother? How did a woman survive, protect herself, and wield influence in that boundless, unforgiving landscape of grass and sky? Did a young Mongol girl possess the same rights as her brother? Let us begin our journey by understanding the world of the Mongol Empire and the women who helped shape it. The Mongol Empire, as we know it, formally began with the reign of Genghis Khan in 1206. But what existed before? A mosaic of separate warring tribes, constantly shifting between conflict and alliance. And in this delicate dance, women were often the diplomats. Diplomatic marriages were common, and a woman, upon marrying, never truly severed ties with her birth family. Instead, she became a crucial link, a skilled navigator, constantly balancing the interests of her husband's family with those of her own. Generally, within the Turco-Mongol states, especially when compared to the ancient Muslim East, women enjoyed significantly broader rights and agency. They could be, and often were, rulers. Yes, often as regents for their young sons, or holding power during a transition of power. But they ruled nonetheless, making decisions that shaped the fate of thousands. Furthermore, the wives of Khans possessed their own property, their own wealth, their own herds and servants, which was solely theirs. Even the great Khan himself had no claim to it. This was not a trivial matter. It was a fundamental economic power. Women also had a voice in the Kurultai, the great assembly where the most crucial political decisions were made. The fate of nations decided, and it was attended by both men and women. Their opinions carried weight. And while polygamy was practiced, the wives often formed a cooperative, if sometimes competitive, council, and at times were the true administrators of the state, the steady hands on the reins of power while the men were at war. For many of us, our familiarity with Mongol culture comes through the lens of the Golden Horde and the great sweeping invasions that reshaped the map of the world. But what was the secret to their breathtaking military success? A key reason was the clear and efficient division of labor, a societal structure that was both pragmatic and resilient. Men were free to dedicate themselves entirely to war, to campaign for years, to be wounded, to die on distant battlefields, without the entire social and economic structure collapsing back home. We often think of the Golden Horde as a specific place where the Khan held court. But the word Orda simply means a mobile community, a vast traveling city of people, their belongings, and their herds, a society on the move. And at the heart of each of these mobile communities, these traveling cities, was a woman. Not that she single-handedly managed every minute detail, but she was its chief executive, its organizing principle. She had a full staff, both men and women, a complex bureaucracy on the move to carry out her directives. It is also fascinating that in many of the settled states they encountered, like China, with its intricate and ancient bureaucracy, a similar administrative hierarchy was mirrored within the Mongol camps. So, a woman always stood at the head of an orda, whether she was the senior or a junior wife, as it happened. And beneath her was a layered administration of officials managing the herds, the supplies, the guests, the children, and all the myriad affairs of daily life, from justice to celebration. A woman's right to property evolved with her status. An unmarried girl, as often was the case in many historical societies, was the most dependent, possessing little of her own beyond her personal effects. But upon marriage, her status transformed. She gained control of her dowry, and sometimes even the bride price her husband had paid her family, a substantial sum that represented her value. This wealth was hers to manage, to invest, to grow. However, the most privileged and powerful position was held by a woman who had borne a son. A boy would be allocated a share of the family's inheritance from childhood, and until he came of age, his mother was the steward, the guardian, the chief executive of that wealth, a position that granted her immense influence within the family structure. Furthermore, while the men were away on their lengthy campaigns, sometimes for years at a time, the women not only maintained the home, but also received their designated portion of the spoils after each victory. They were given shares of captured slaves, herds of livestock, bundles of silk, and sometimes new lands to oversee and administer. And the women were shrewd, brilliant managers. They multiplied these resources, traded them, and built their own independent sources of power and wealth. Of course, in name, everything was under the husband's ultimate authority. But where was the husband? He was perpetually at war, distant, a name and a message, while the real, day-to-day empire of the household, the economy of the order, awaited the guidance and the wise, firm hand of a woman. It is vital to understand that the primary forms of wealth, the true capital in this nomadic society, were not gold or land in the static sense, but people and animals. The size of one's herd, the loyalty of one's followers, these were the measures of power. Speaking of people, it is a poignant and interesting note that Genghis Khan's own mother, Hoylun, was initially reluctant to share her own followers, her own personal people, with her son Temujin before he became great. He was her son, but they were her security, her leverage in a dangerous world. In stark contrast, his wife Borta, after a successful campaign, was given a personal gift of 1,000 people who became her dedicated guard, her personal staff, a visible manifestation of her high status and the trust her husband placed in her. 2 other, lesser wives also received their own allocations of servants and warriors, their own small courts within the greater court. So, how was family life structured among the Mongols? Once again, it often came down to wealth and social standing. The richer and more powerful a man was, the more wives he could afford, primarily because of the substantial bride price required to compensate a family for the loss of their daughter, a beloved member and a potential diplomatic asset. If a man could not pay this price up front, he might enter the family as a sort of indentured servant, working for years, sometimes decades, to earn his bride through labor and demonstrated loyalty. A young boy, 10 years old, might be sent to his future wife's family, where he would live and work, performing sometimes menial tasks, learning their ways, and proving his worth and devotion to his new family. But what of the men who had neither wealth nor the patience for such long-term arrangements? They resorted to the old, brutal practice of stealing brides. This was not a symbolic ritual or an elopement. It was a literal, violent abduction, often carried out during the wedding journey itself, as the bride traveled in a vulnerable state from her parents' home to her new husband's. This is precisely how Genghis Khan's father, Yesuge, acquired his wife, Hoelin. He saw her, desired her, and with a band of his men, stole her from her wedding party. A traumatic and violent beginning to a life together. Marriages between close relatives were also forbidden, a cultural taboo. However, since Mongol society was strongly patrilineal, tracing descent and inheritance through the male line, yet property and influence could sometimes be held and transmitted through the female line. Finding suitable marriage partners was a complex social puzzle. One could not marry a paternal cousin, as they were considered too close. The solution? The elegant loophole? Relatives on the mother's side were not considered kin for marriage purposes. So it was common, acceptable, and even strategically advantageous to marry a maternal cousin, the daughter of one's mother's sister. While these unions, over generations, sometimes led to genetic issues, as can be seen in the later history of Genghis Khan's line, the Genghisids, they were an effective and preferred way to keep property, influence, and political power concentrated within a powerful, extended family network. And if you had stolen your bride, as Yasuge did, it was considered wise, eventually, to make peace with her family, to turn an act of war into an alliance. A sign of respect and reconciliation was for the parents to accompany the newlyweds on their journey to their new home. A parent's refusal to do so was a grave and public insult, a signal of lasting enmity and disapproval that could have consequences for years to come. What became of a woman if her husband died? This was a moment of extreme vulnerability. Very often, she entered into a levirate marriage, wedding a younger brother of her deceased husband, or sometimes even a senior son from another wife. This was not a matter of sentiment or romance, but of stark economic and political necessity. It was the primary way to prevent the widow, who controlled her own property and that of her young children, from leaving and taking that entire wealth to another family, perhaps even a rival clan. This was a catastrophic loss the original clan could not afford. The woman, and all she possessed, was a resource to be retained. Within a household of multiple wives, the hierarchy was rigid, clearly defined, and visually expressed in the layout of the camp. A man might have 4 principal wives, with the rest holding the status of concubines. But for a great Khan, there could be even more. The senior wife held the title of Khatun, the ruler, the lady, and she commanded the primary, wealthiest, and most prestigious orda. She had her own residence, her own treasury, her own staff of administrators, and her own herds, which transported her possessions across the steppe. Other high-ranking wives also managed their own ordas and households, smaller replicas of the main court. The junior wives and concubines, however, lived as dependents, as part of the household, within the establishments of their senior counterparts, their lives and movements more closely supervised. The senior wife's position was powerful, but it was not unassailable. She could be displaced if she grew too old, if she could no longer bear children, or if she proved infertile. Her death could trigger a fierce internal struggle, a quiet war of succession among the women, as the second wife, by order of marriage and status, would typically expect to ascend. But such transitions could sometimes upend the entire familial order, as different sons and their mothers jockeyed for position and favor. The spatial arrangement of the camps reflected this complex and delicate hierarchy. They were laid out in a strict, unbroken line across the landscape. The senior wife established her large, impressive camp in the most honored position, the west. The other wives followed in order of rank, and the most junior wife with any property of her own was positioned in the east, the least honored position. The Khan himself had his own great tent, his court, his administrative center, where he resided and held council, often with his senior wife seated beside him on the throne, a visible symbol of her shared authority. It is a telling, almost symbolic detail that only the senior wife was permitted to sit at her husband's level, as an equal. All other invited guests, junior wives and lesser family members, were seated on much lower stools, their heads respectfully and deliberately lower than the feet of the Khan and the Khatun, a constant physical reminder of their place in the hierarchy. And the Khan, like other powerful men who were constantly at war, when he was home, would not reside in one static place. He was a nomadic ruler within his own domain. He would move with his personal retinue, his bodyguards and closest advisors, traveling with his belongings from the camp of one wife to another, a perpetual guest in his own family, ensuring that no single wife or her sons could monopolize his attention or consolidate too much power in his absence. I must confess, I once held a common misconception, one that seems logical, but is historically inaccurate. I imagined the youngest, most recent wife would receive the most attention, the most affection. The reality, borne out by the historical record, was quite different. The proof is in the simple biological math of children. Senior wives without fertility issues often bore 5 to 9 children, a very high number, while subsequent junior wives typically had only 1 or 2. The primary wife was the partner, the mother of the main heirs. The younger wives were often political and diplomatic additions. This shows that these younger wives were not taken for love or desire alone, though that could be a factor. The motive was rarely simple conquest or personal fancy. In the world of the Khans, a new wife was often a symbol of reconciliation, a living peace treaty that said, "We are one family now. Let the bloodshed end. Let there be peace." And these young women, often teenagers, despite the immense difficulty and loneliness of their position in a new and often hostile family, were expected to perform a delicate, ongoing diplomatic role, balancing loyalties between their old clan and their new one, acting as a channel of communication and a force for moderation. But were these junior wives entirely without privilege, without any moments of honor? Number. There was one singular symbolic moment when a junior wife could sit as an equal beside her husband, when the hierarchy was temporarily suspended, when a formal reception, a feast, or a diplomatic meeting was held in her own tent, within her own camp. On that specific occasion, she was the hostess, the mistress of the domain, the center of attention. She sat beside her husband, and for that evening, she was his equal partner. But in all other settings, in the main court or in the camps of other wives, she yielded her place to her senior, fading back into the structured order of things. Did this intricate system lead to conflict, to jealousy and bitter rivalries? It is difficult to say with certainty from this distance in time, but likely, overt, destructive conflict was rare. The wives often lived at a significant distance from one another, each the sovereign of her own thriving, busy establishment, with her own worries, her own successes, her own circle of dependence. With their own separate responsibilities, resources, and spheres of influence, what was there to truly fight over on a daily basis? The structure, for all its rigidity, may have provided a form of peace through separation. And what was the ultimate fate of the wives when the Khan himself died? We have already seen one path, the levirate marriage. to keep the property and the family intact. But we also carry a darker, more dramatic image from stories of ancient pharaohs, of wives and concubines accompanying their lord into the afterlife. The reality for the Mongols was more nuanced and in some ways more chillingly pragmatic. While the widows grieved, they were not expected to join him in death. Their administrative and political value was too great. That grim fate was often reserved for concubines, lower status women who might be ritually killed, often strangled, to serve him in the next world. It was a brutal, stark practicality. Valuable resources, meaning the legitimate wives who managed complex households, protected heirs, and held alliances together, were not to be wasted. So a senior wife like Hoelun could find herself married 3 times, each time to secure the future of her family and her people. Her life a continuous thread of resilience and adaptation. But what was the daily substance, the tangible reality of a woman's life in these camps? As we have seen, men focused on war, politics, hunting, and the production of essentials like fermented mare's milk or kumis. Women, meanwhile, were the chief executives, the beating heart of the camp's entire existence. They ensured that this vast, mobile community of people and animals not only survived but thrived, that it was a functioning, productive society on the move. Their most demanding, logistically staggering responsibility was the seasonal migration.
The entire camp, hundreds of yurts, countless possessions, thousands of people had to be meticulously packed, loaded onto a vast train of carts and wagons, and transported across immense trackless distances, then re-established, like a city rising from the ground in a new location chosen for its water and pasture. Beyond this monumental task, women of all ranks were involved in every imaginable aspect of life, preparing food over open fires, raising children, crafting clothing from hides and felt, making ropes, curing leather, creating dairy products. Their duties were endless, vital, and required immense skill. And this included the sophisticated, knowledgeable management of the herds themselves, the true wealth of the nation. When we imagine this life, we might picture a woman confined to her yurt, but the opposite was true. Mongol women possessed a remarkable degree of freedom of movement and responsibility. Every child, boy and girl alike, was taught to ride almost as soon as they could walk, to feel the rhythm of the horse beneath them, to see the horizon as their home. This universal mobility, this deep intuitive intimacy with the horse, was perhaps one of the hidden, foundational sources of the Mongols' incredible military success and social flexibility. When Genghis Khan set out on a major campaign, one of his wives would often accompany him to manage his mobile field headquarters, the traveling court that moved with the army. Meanwhile, his senior wife, in our case Borte, remained behind, governing the stable heart of the empire, the home territory, ensuring the continuity of daily life, the administration of justice, and the steady flow of supplies to the front, a role of immense trust and responsibility. The scale of these mobile courts, these ordas, was simply staggering to contemporary observers. An account from a visitor to the ordas in later centuries details the immense, mind-boggling logistics. Precise provisions for the women's separate households, specific items like cabinets and fastenings, dedicated supplies for the water and stable departments responsible for camels and pack horses, and wages for a small army of specialized staff. Servant girls,
Eunuchs, guards, kitchen workers, caravan drivers, muleteers, and scribes. A single wife of the Khan might require 200 to 300 carts, each pulled by oxen or camels, just for her personal needs, her yurt, her possessions, her servants. A full royal caravan could involve 10,000 people, a slow-moving metropolis winding its way across the landscape. Imagine the sight, the sound, the dust, the organized chaos, and at the head of that colossal caravan, the chief decision-maker, the organizer, was most likely a woman, a Khatun, directing the movement of her world. How did these women grow their personal wealth, their independent power? Beyond expertly managing their herds and receiving their share of the spoils of war, they were often given entire territories to administer, conquered lands from which they could collect taxes and tribute. They oversaw artisans, settled disputes, and managed resources from mines and forests. This was not a generous allowance from their husbands. It was their own domain, their personal fiefdom, to manage as they saw fit, to make profitable. They could engage in long-distance trade, buy and sell commodities, make investments and loans, all without needing to seek a husband's permission. A practical necessity, given that their husbands were often absent for years at a time, fighting on the other side of the known world. It was impossible to send a message and wait months for a reply. The women had to be autonomous rulers. There is a remarkable, almost disbelieving account from European monks who visited the Golden Horde and stumbled upon a large, prosperous settlement run entirely by women and children. There was not a man in sight. They were all away at war. Yet, the monks reported, there was no chaos, no disorder. The women were conducting business, managing complex affairs, settling disputes, and maintaining perfect order with what seemed like effortless competence and authority. For these monks, coming from a deeply patriarchal society, it was a shocking vision. A world turned upside down, a functioning gynocracy that challenged all their assumptions. In addition to all these immense responsibilities, women, of course, bore and raised the next generation of Mongols. But the approach was strikingly communal, not isolated. A woman, especially a privileged one with vast responsibilities, was not expected to be the sole isolated caregiver, confined to a yurt with a child. It was common, practical, and utterly unremarkable for children to be sent for long stays with relatives, to their grandparents for the summer, or to their mother's native family for a year, or to be cared for by a team of hired nurses and nannies. This was not seen as neglect. It was a sensible way to strengthen family bonds across the extended clan, to give children different experiences, and to free up the mother to attend to her weighty administrative duties. It took a tribe to raise a child, and the Mongols never forgot that. What were these children taught? What values were instilled in them as they grew up under the vast sky? Both boys and girls were taught from their earliest years a powerful, unshakable sense of honor, personal dignity, and profound respect for elders and for tradition. But interestingly, and this is a beautiful nuance, they were also schooled in the art of poetry, in the power of the spoken word. It was believed that by the age of 15, a well-educated young person, regardless of gender, should be able to wield metaphor and metonymy with skill, to describe their feelings with elegance, and to spontaneously weave an entertaining, meaningful story. Mothers played a central role in this oral education. In a culture without a widespread written language until the 13th century, the ability to craft beautiful, persuasive, memorable speech was not a mere luxury for the elite. It was an essential tool of leadership, diplomacy, and cultural preservation.
Mothers were also the primary peacemakers, the mediators between their sons, especially competitive half-brothers from different wives, who could be rivals for their father's favor and the future inheritance. It was their crucial, often unacknowledged task to smooth over conflicts, to counsel patience, to prevent the order from tearing itself apart in a fratricidal war after the Khan's death. The mother was the glue that held the family and thus the state together. Girls from a very young age were trained in the subtle arts of diplomacy and intelligence. Genghis Khan himself famously said that the primary role of a wife was to receive guests. But this was not mere hospitality, not just about serving tea and food. It was a sophisticated form of intelligence gathering and strategic communication. She was to welcome visitors, to discern their true intentions beneath the polite words, to gently probe for information, to hint at expected outcomes, to gauge the mood of an ally or an enemy, to be, in essence, her husband's chief diplomatic advisor and his most trusted spy, all while presenting a face of graceful hospitality. Both boys and girls learned the practical skills of steppe life, to tend and care for the vast herds, to shoot a bow with accuracy, to ride a horse with fearless skill. But around the age of 10 or 12, their paths began to diverge more sharply. Boys focused more intensely on the advanced arts of war, strategy, and command. Girls, meanwhile, moved more decisively into administration, logistics, and resource management. They learned to manage the herds not just as animals, but as capital, to diagnose their illnesses, to plan the great seasonal migrations to the best pastures, to calculate fodder for the winter. This was not simple manual labor. It was a comprehensive curriculum in leadership, negotiation, economics, and long-term planning. They were being groomed to be the CEOs of mobile city-states. When daughters of noble families married, often for political reasons, they did not vanish into their husband's clan, losing their identity. They remained powerful, active representatives of their own birth family, of their father's empire. All 5 daughters of Borte and Genghis Khan, for example, were married to rulers of neighboring tribes and kingdoms to secure alliances. But they never ceased to be the eyes, ears, and voice of their father's power. They reported back. They influenced policy. They ensured that their husband's loyalty to the great Khan remained firm. They were empresses in their own right, governing foreign lands in the name of their birth family. There is a stunning example of this influence centuries later with a princess named Nangi, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, who was married to a Korean prince to secure a political alliance. When the prince, for whatever reason, refused to fulfill his conjugal duties to her, to treat her as his wife, he was swiftly and decisively deposed from his position. The message was clear and brutal. No one, no matter how high their own rank, could disrespect a daughter of the great Khan's sacred line with impunity. The blood of Genghis Khan was a shield and a weapon. And now we come to the intimate personal stories of the 2 women who were absolutely fundamental to the man Genghis Khan became, his mother, Holen, and his wife, Borte. Their lives were not just footnotes, they were epic tales of immense hardship, cunning, and breathtaking resilience. We first meet Holin as a teenager, a beautiful girl from a good family, newly and happily married to a man named Chiledu. It was a prosperous, well-arranged match. Everything settled properly, the bride price paid, the future secure. But as the wedding party traveled from her parents' home to her new life, they were ambushed by a band of riders, a common hazard of the steppe. Among them was Yesuge, a charismatic and forceful leader. He saw Hoelin was instantly captivated by her beauty and spirit, and in a moment that would alter history, simply took her. He and his men carried her off to his own tent, and he declared her his wife. Imagine the sheer gut-wrenching shock and terror for that 15-year-old girl. One day, she was a celebrated bride in a joyful procession. The next, she was the stolen prize of a stranger, a bandit. She must have waited, her heart pounding, hoping against hope that her rightful husband, Chiledu, a powerful man in his own right, would come with his warriors to rescue her, to reclaim his honor and his wife. But days turned into weeks, and no one came. Chiledu, for reasons lost to history, never appeared, and Holon, a practical survivor, had no choice but to adapt, to bury her past and face her new, uncertain reality. She was utterly isolated, cut off from her parents, her siblings, everything familiar. She discovered that Yesuge already had a chief wife, who had even borne him a son, making Hoelun's position even more precarious. But soon, something shifted. Hoelun, perhaps seen as more promising, from a better lineage, or simply more compelling, supplanted this first wife in Yesuge's favor, becoming his senior wife at his own command. As the new mistress of the household, she was suddenly responsible for managing his entire establishment, a daunting and complex task for anyone, let alone a young woman who had been violently brought into it. Life, with all its relentless demands, absorbed her. Over the next 9 years, she bore Yesuge 5 children, 4 of them sons, the eldest named Temujin, the future Genghis Khan. Hoelun, it seems, had a great expansive capacity for love and compassion. The chronicles tell us she also took in orphaned and abandoned boys, believing that a foundling was a gift from the heavens, to be cherished and raised as one's own. Her yurt was a busy, noisy place, full of life and energy. As Temujin grew, it was time to find him a wife, a strategic decision that was also a chance to mend the old rift with Hoelun's original family, to turn a past enmity into a future alliance. The plan was for him to marry a relative from her clan. When Temujin was 9, the customary age for a formal betrothal, Yesuge took him on the long journey to visit them. Strangely, pointedly, Hoelun was not invited, a painful exclusion for the mother. On the road, under the vast blue sky, fate dramatically intervened. Yesuge met Dai Sechen, the wise and respected leader of the Ungurad tribe. Dai Sechen spoke of a powerful, vivid dream he had. A white falcon, a symbol of power and destiny, had flown to him, clutching both the sun and the moon in its talons. He took this as a profound omen, directly related to Yesuge's son. Flattered, or perhaps genuinely superstitious, Yesuge agreed on the spot to betroth Temujin to Dai Sechen's own intelligent 10-year-old daughter, a girl named Borte. The parents, looking at the 2 children, noted the fire in their eyes, a spark of destiny. Temujin was left with Borte's family to live, to work, and to get to know his future bride, his labor serving as the bride price for a family that despite its status, could not afford multiple such payments for all its children. On his journey home, riding alone, Yasuge encountered a group of Tatars, old and bitter rivals of the Mongols. They invited him to feast, a seemingly friendly gesture. It was a fatal decision. The food or drink was poisoned, a common tactic of steppe warfare. Yasuge managed to ride home, racked with pain, only to die shortly after his last gasped words a command to his people to bring Temujin back immediately, to break the betrothal and secure the heir. So Temujin was retrieved, the promising alliance with Borte's family abruptly broken. For the next 10 long years, he and Borte would have no contact, their childhood promise suspended, their futures uncertain. For Hoylan, Yasuge's death was a personal and political catastrophe. She was abandoned with several young children, one just a helpless infant. The clan, seeing her as a vulnerable widow with no powerful protector, turned its back on her, refusing to honor her as the senior widow, leaving her without a share of the herds or the followers. She was left utterly alone, a single mother with no means of support in the harsh, pitiless steppe, a situation that was often a death sentence. Temujin's life, in turn, descended into a brutal struggle for survival. He was captured, enslaved, humiliated, and lived in constant danger, his family a target for every rival. But Hoylan, only 25 years old at the time of her husband's death, fought back with a ferocity born of maternal love. The chronicles poetically tell how she scoured the barren land for wild roots, garlic, and berries, hunted small game like marmots, and did everything a mother possibly could to keep her children from starving. Her sheer, unyielding will was the force that ensured all 5 of her children not only survived their desperate childhood, but grew into strong, capable adults. Her most vital unspoken role was to preserve a sense of home, a place, however meager, for her scattered children to return to, and to keep the simmering rivalries between her sons from exploding into violence, a task at which she ultimately, tragically failed when her sons, led by Temujin, killed their half-brother Begder to eliminate a potential rival for the inheritance that she, as the senior widow, still nominally controlled. And so we turn, at last, to Borte, the girl who waited. Borte became the wife of Genghis Khan. She was the girl with the luminous face, the daughter of Descendant, the one chosen by a dream. Her influence on Temujin began the moment they were finally, formally wed, and lasted until the very end of his life, a partnership that shaped an empire. Many wonder if theirs was a great love story, a romance for the ages. They had barely known each other as children, their betrothal broken for a decade. Yet what emerged was a deep, abiding trust, a partnership of equals in a world of brutal inequality. Genghis Khan, the most powerful man of his age, constantly sought her counsel, valued her judgment. When faced with a cryptic, threatening message from a foreign ambassador, his first instinct was not to consult his generals, but to go to Borte, or to his mother Hoylan, to decipher its true meaning, to understand the human motives behind the words. Borte, being naturally decisive and perceptive, often spoke before her more cautious mother-in-law, her insight sharp and direct. After a decade of struggle, Temujin, now a young man of 18 or 19, had rebuilt his family's shattered standing through sheer force of will and cunning alliances. He had acquired yurts, herds, and a growing band of loyal followers. He sent a formal message to Descendant. It was time to honor their old agreement, to revive the promise made all those years ago. Descendant perhaps seeing the rising star, welcomed him. The wedding was held, a joyous occasion, and Borte brought with her a magnificent dowry, a sign of her status, which included a priceless, exquisitely crafted black sable coat, a treasure of immense value. But there was a clear, chilling undercurrent of tension. Tradition solemnly demanded that the bride's parents escort the couple on the first part of their journey to their new home. The aged Dai Sechen, however, pleaded weakness and turned back at the very edge of his own camp, a deliberate and profound sign of disrespect and lingering doubt. Only Borte's mother, loving and courageous, accompanied them the full symbolic way. It seems Borte was given away with reluctance, with a family fear that Temujin, like his father before him, was more a successful bandit than a truly noble leader, a dangerous man to tie one's fate to. Yet, despite this inauspicious start, the marriage proved to be the turning point Temujin needed. Borte's legitimacy, her noble Ungurad bloodline, and her impressive dowry instantly restored his social and political status, transforming him from an upstart chieftain into a legitimate alliance maker. In a gesture of respect and unity, she presented the magnificent sable coat to her new mother-in-law, Holun. But Temujin, with a visionary's eye, saw beyond its beauty to its political utility. He asked them, he needed their consent, to use it not as a garment, but as the ultimate diplomatic gift. They agreed. The coat was presented to the powerful Mongol Khan, and it secured a pivotal, life-saving alliance that became the bedrock of Temujin's early power. Borte's dowry had bought him an army. Borte then settled into the same demanding, all-encompassing administrative role that Holun had once mastered. She managed the camp, the people, the supplies. Then came the defining, terrifying crisis of her early life, a test that would shadow her for decades. The Merkit tribe, seeking vengeance for Yesugei's theft of Holun years before, launched a surprise savage dawn raid on Temujin's camp. In the frantic, panicked midnight escape, in the chaos and the darkness, there were not enough horses for everyone. Astonishingly, inexplicably, Borte, the senior wife, the Khatun, was left behind, along with an old servant woman and another secondary wife. Whether by a tragic, catastrophic oversight in the confusion, or by some cold, calculated decision by Temujin to save himself and his most loyal fighters first, she was abandoned. The Merkit riders swept in and captured them. The Merkits, in a cruel twist of poetic justice, forced her to marry the younger brother of her mother-in-law's first husband, the very man Chiledu, from whom Holun had been stolen. We do not know how long she was held in that alien camp, surrounded by the people who were her family's enemies, or the precise nature of that forced marriage, only that the chronicles note she was left physically unharmed. Temujin, shamed and enraged, gathered his allies and, after months, attacked the Merkit camp with focused fury. He rode through the chaos, calling out her name over and over. Borte, hearing his voice, ran to him through the smoke and confusion, and they escaped together, a reunion charged with relief, trauma, and unspoken questions. Soon after her return, she gave birth to her first son Yoshi, whose name tellingly means the guest. His paternity was forever shadowed by a cloud of doubt. Was he the son of Genghis Khan, conceived just before the abduction, or was he the son of her Merkit captor? Genghis Khan himself, in a decisive act of will, publicly and firmly claimed Yoshi as his own, his firstborn son, stating that he knew Borte was already pregnant before the terrible raid. The timeline of her subsequent pregnancies does make this plausible. But in the end, for the Khan, the word of the father was all that mattered. His declaration was the truth. Borte would go on to bear him 8 more children, 4 sons and 5 daughters, all of whom would play crucial, powerful roles in the empire he forged, the seeds of a dynasty. Genghis Khan died in 1227 at the height of his power. Borte, his lifelong partner, his first and most trusted wife, survived him, living on until 1235. Visitors to her court in her later years noted that she still commanded her own guard, her own separate establishment, and lived with the authority and respect befitting a founding matriarch, communicating with her powerful and far-flung children who ruled corners of the empire. Her final years, however, were clouded by a deep private sorrow. Yokchi, the son of disputed origins, had quarreled bitterly with his father over strategy and succession, had withdrawn from court to the distant steppes of his own domain, and died shortly before Genghis Khan himself, likely poisoned on the orders of his own father, who saw him as a disobedient and potentially divisive figure. Borte, the strong, the resilient, the Khatun, died with a heart weighed down by this ultimate familial tragedy. The mother who had lost a son to the ruthless machinery of the empire she helped build. And so we arrive at the final, quiet truth of this story, a truth not carved in stone, but woven into the very fabric of life itself, a whisper on the wind that has become a roar across centuries. We have walked alongside his mother, his wives, the women of his court. We've seen how each, in her own way, became a thread in a grand living tapestry, a human network of immense complexity and power. His vision was always dual. It went beyond temporary borders and passing armies. It was a dream of lineage, a silent biological command to fill the world with his own blood, to outlast the mortality of stone monuments. His sons were sent to rule distant lands with one overriding purpose: to multiply, to establish new branches of the family tree. His daughters were strategically married to become queens, carrying his legacy, his genes, and his political will into foreign dynasties, forever altering their genetic and political future. It was an empire consciously, deliberately building its own biological future, one generation, one marriage, one child at a time. For ages, this remained a whisper in the halls of history, a rumor in the chronicles, a legend almost too great, too audacious to believe. Then, centuries later, a revelation emerged, not from dusty scrolls or ancient ruins, but from the deepest, most fundamental code of human existence. A certain genetic signature, a unique, unchangeable mark in the bloodstream of millions of unrelated men, began to tell a story that words and chronicles never could. A story written in the language of biology. The numbers that echoed back from supercomputers and population studies were beyond ordinary comprehension. 16 million, a silent, invisible dynasty, far vaster, more enduring, and more personal than any kingdom of land he ever ruled. Its borders defined not by rivers or mountains, but by the double helix itself. And on that thought, so deep, so quiet, and so endlessly lingering, we leave the past behind for tonight. Thank you for listening, for sharing this journey into the silent echoes of history. May your sleep be peaceful, and your dreams as boundless as the steppe itself. Good night.